Thank you all so much for having me here. I know that you're probably thinking, who the heck is this guy? Um, so, like Deborah said, my name is Shane Hanlon. I work at the Story Collider, and I just figured it'd be good to give you a sense of how I come to this world. So I am a PhD by training. I did my research in amphibian disease ecology years ago now. I was doing this math the other day, and about 15 years ago, I went to grad school, and I was a young, perhaps naive, burgeoning scientist. And the way that my research worked was that I would do field seasons, so every summer I would do my research, and then fall, spring, end up writing up those results. And so coming out of my first field season, I did an experiment. It worked quite well. I was very excited to actually get that experiment published. And so I worked with my advisor, we wrote it up, and I submitted it to a journal that I thought was a good journal, a journal that was in my field, respected, but one of the things about this journal was that it was really focused on methods. Basically, if your methods were sound, you're gonna get published. And that was really important because the results we found from this specific experiment were somewhat counterintuitive. Not necessarily controversial, it was just kind of a burgeoning field. So we wanted to make sure that we were getting things out there so that folks could add to that I could then later add to it. So we we submit the manuscript, we go through that process, and I forget about it because I got a lot of stuff going on. I'm a first year, second year grad student. 3 months later, we get a results back. It's a rejection. Okay, that happens. There's a lot of rejection in science. I got used to rejection over the years, frankly. But a thing bothered me about the process was that there were 3 reviewers. 2 reviewers were accept with minor revisions, that type of thing. But there was a third reviewer, and I don't know if it was like actually reviewer number 2, but I do remember that they didn't accept it. They didn't accept that I was it felt like they didn't accept that I was being truthful. They didn't accept that my methods were sound. And in some respects, it felt like they said I was a liar. And I didn't love that, especially as a new scientist. I thought, oh my gosh, this is how my scientific career is going to go. And my advisor encouraged me to talk to the editor. So we chatted, and he said, yeah, this isn't right. Like, you should file a formal kind of complaint system, which I should have been cued in that they actually had a formal complaint system that you could file, but I did. I went through this process, and it was kind of twofold. Thing one was I just don't agree with this reviewer's assessment. Like, here is the data in the manuscript, and then also, in the interim, we had done more studies. And so here's some of that preliminary data kind of backing up these perhaps counterintuitive results. So there's a factual component of it. But thing two, there was a story there that I wanted to tell. I wanted to tell the story of, like, not to, I understand this isn't how science works, but perhaps this is literally like my first manuscript. This is the first thing that I've ever done, my first author manuscript. And I went through the process. I checked all the boxes. I did all the things that you wanted me to do. Like, I did all these things. Why is it not working? Like, why did we have to go through this process? So I was introduced to this idea of telling my story, not just like the research that I was doing, but like this personal aspect of why this really mattered to me. And so I went through the process, resubmitted. This time I literally did forget about it. It was 6 or 7 months later. And in that time, I did another study. I had actually had another manuscript. It didn't end up being my first manuscript that came out. It came back, and it got accepted. Relatively minor revisions. And it taught me a lot about the scientific process. It taught me a lot about the process of getting something published. But it also taught me the value, maybe perhaps in retrospect, I don't know if I thought about it really at the time, but the power of story. And that's what I am here today to talk to all of you lovely people about, is this power of story. Deborah did a great job of kind of outlining the story collider, but I'm here in DC. I live right across the river in Virginia, and my role at Story Collider most times is we do these shows roughly every other month, usually in bars, where people come up on stage. That's an important part, where people come up on stage and they tell true personal stories about science. What's really important about this is it's not just scientists. It's not just even people who are related to the scientists. It's literally anyone. We want to really show that everyone has a story about science, whether they are a PhD like me, or if the last time they thought about science was in 8th grade when they were forced to take like a geology class or something. And so that's how I come to all of you today with story. And I wanted to give you just a quick kind of history about my bona fides. Like, how do I come to y'all's world? Because I am not a publisher, but I am adjacent to publishing in many roles that I do, and I am a professional science communicator. So I've seen a lot of this, and I've worked with a lot of folks who are in this industry. I ended up publishing a decent amount of articles or manuscripts as a researcher. I haven't been a researcher for at least 10 years now, but I was really lucky, let's say, and fortunate in kind of my research career. I'm in the science communication space now. I now help folks tell their stories. And so I've been in kind of the popular science, maybe more like editorial, letter to the editor, that type of thing space. So again, I am not the one doing the publishing, but I've worked within this industry, within these programs, to get science out there in different forms. And I have to say this, and Deborah alluded to this up top, I am here as a representative of the Story Collider. Can't stress that enough. My day job, I work for AGU, the American Geophysical Union. I teach scientists how to communicate more effectively. I run our podcast. This voice is in people's ears every single week, for better or for worse. I run our plain spoken blog where people talk about science. I have worked with the folks in our publishing department at AGU on things like helping to create guidelines for folks to craft plain language abstracts and plain language summaries, and work with some of the authors of our journals, specifically this Perspectives of Earth and Space Science. These are people who tell personal stories about science through manuscripts. So you're going to see a bunch of examples in the next like half hour or so, and they're not going to be all AGU, but they're going to be skewed that way. That's just because it's what I know. So just like keep that in mind. I'm not here on their capacity, but I can't help my own experiences. This is what I know. And when I was kind of having some of the initial conversations about doing this and kind of thinking about what I wanted to talk to you all about today, I had to think, why would authors want to go through, like why publishing? Like why actually publishing kind of the accepted norms within the scientific industry? And I created this outline to basically create a talk through, and I was like, no, you know what, I'm gonna throw this up there and just talk about this, because this is what I would have thought about when I was thinking, like, why put my work in manuscripts? Why do talks at conferences, that type of thing? And this is from my personal experience, but also things that I've heard. I have many friends who are still active researchers, and I'm still doing a little bit of this myself. And things like manuscripts are obviously an outlet for authors. They are the accepted outlet for authors. They're the main one, that main metric. But one thing I really started thinking about is that any sort of pushback I hear from some of my researcher friends, like, oh, the publishing industry, like, or why do we have to go through this complicated process? Why do we have to do this? They think they want to do it themselves. They don't. And I don't mean that in any like good or a bad way. I am adjacent to many of y'all's world, but I've seen that process. And if folks actually knew what went into this process, many researchers don't have time to do just kind of like the science communication type work that I'm encouraging them to do, kind of this public outreach work, let alone go through the process of actually getting science out to peers, out to funders, out to maybe the general non-science public. I work a lot with early career folks, and this is how I felt when I was a grad student doing research. I wanted to get my work out there, so at the time I thought it was going to be other scientists. I thought I wanted to go into academia, and I made a switch from that, but I wanted to get my work out there so folks could see it, so that I would potentially have other career options. One thing about that I don't know that folks really appreciate kind of on the research side of things is that manuscripts and the kind of publishing more broadly, it's this focused readership. You know exactly where you're going. You know like what the manuscripts are in your field. You know what the big or small journals are. We just know where to go to find out what's going on in the sciences. And something I think is underappreciated, even within the kind of like academic publishing, again, this is from my world, sphere of things, there are a variety of ways for folks to tell their stories, whether that's stories directly of their research, whether they are just presenting results and maybe not even thinking that it's a story, whether that's at a scientific conference, whatever it might be. And so like this is the area that I really want to focus on. And on the flip side of that, I had to really think about like why would folks not necessarily be interested in going through scientific manuscripts? Why might they be a little bit disenchanted with this process? I'm not going to dive really deep into this because y'all are the experts on this, but again, these are things that I've thought about and that I have heard, like it costs money. And I'm not putting on the AGU hat, but I know a lot about this right this very second. This idea of lack of open access, this is changing. And again, I know this from personal experience. These two probably go hand in hand. Uneven review process. I had experience with that. I understand that it is incredibly frustrated, but on the flip side, I think the review process, like we need scientists reviewing other scientists' work. The timelines can be really long. And then also there might be this perception that there's a lack of variety of ways for folks to tell their stories. And I personally disagree with this, but I could see this perception coming across. And I don't think that story is a solve for all of these things. I'm not saying that it is like the magic wand that's going to fix everything, but it might help. Story is a really powerful tool to convey message, to communicate. Everything that I do in my communication roles are through story. And I just have to acknowledge that I'm talking about story mostly from a mechanics perspective. Storytelling, specifically storytelling in the sciences, is not a new thing. Storytelling is this word that's been thrown around in the science space, in marketing spaces, in communication spaces, in the 5, maybe past 10 years. That like, oh my gosh, we discovered storytelling. We didn't. I didn't, I will say. But there are entire communities and cultures and people who have been using story to not only communicate, but this line that we've created between storytelling and science and whatever else it might be, that line does not exist. So I just want to be very upfront and be very aware that I'm going to talk about the mechanics of storytelling, the way that storytelling can be used to convey messages. I didn't create this. Like, this is not a new idea. I'm just trying to really kind of like fine-tune some of the points. One thing I hear often is that I'm not a storyteller, and I can be anyone. It can be someone that I'm working with for a Story Collider show. We had one last week here in DC. We had 4 storytellers. 2 of the folks are seasoned storytellers. They tell stories all around the city at for different audiences and different venues. And 2 of those folks have never been on stage full stop, let alone tell a story. And I hear this in my Story Collider role. I hear this when I work with scientists to try to help them communicate their science. I hear this in my personal life when I'm trying to convince my friends, like, hey, come out and tell a story. Like, I'm not a storyteller. I can't tell stories. I am not good at this. That is false. Every single one of us are storytellers, whether or not we believe it or not. Now, maybe I'm going to run through some mechanics on like what makes a good story and like the importance of story and that type of thing. So maybe we haven't thought about the specifics of, oh yeah, what's a story arc? Or, oh, how does my story fit into this specific narrative theme? Maybe that's true, sure. Every conversation we have has some element of story in it. Maybe it's not a good story. I don't always tell good stories. When we do these shows, my co-host and I, we do these bits in between. And the whole reason we do them is to warm up the audience so that the stories we're actually crafting and people we're working with, they can tell really good stories. Our stories are kind of intentionally bad. So I'm not saying we're all telling really great stories, but when you ask someone what they did this weekend, even if it's just like, oh, I don't know, I took my kid to a baseball game. Like, that's a quick, not very exciting story, but that's still a story. So we are doing this all the time, and we've been telling stories. We, as a greater culture, have been telling stories as long as we've been communicating. Almost all of human history has been passed down through story in one way or another, whether that's oral, whether that's written, whatever it might be. And so one thing, like, there are a handful of things I would love for y'all to take away from this, and I'm nowhere near done at this point, but one thing I would love for everyone to take away from this is that regardless of whether it's you talking about what you do in your job or how to help authors tell their stories or whatever it might be, that we are all storytellers and that we can all tell stories. That's the biggest thing I feel like most folks, and myself included, if you would have told me 7 years ago now that I would be, first off, this is awesome. But second, that I could call myself a professional storyteller, that's the most ridiculous thing that I would have ever heard in my entire life. So remember that we tell stories all the time. We are already doing this, and it might just be a function of crafting it or framing it or using some of these elements to tell stories of specific topics or what we do or whatever it might be. And I don't just think storytelling is a good thing because it's my job and it's because it's what I'm paid to do. That helps, but I got into storytelling because there's science behind it. First and foremost, I am a scientist. Granted, what I do now, it was more on the work that I do, the research I'm pulling from is more of the social science side of things, less of the, like, I literally worked with frogs and turtles for my PhD. But there is a science behind how we communicate and how we tell stories. So, for example, if I'm telling a story where I was running down the street, chasing after my dog, and then I tripped over the curb and ended up like smacking my head off the grass or something, the same parts of my brain that are being used to say that story are the same parts of your brains that are being used to hear that story. There is this mirroring, there is this activation, this neurological activation that when we tell really compelling stories with a lot of action, with a lot of scenery, with a lot of image setting, we literally connect on a neurological level. When I say action verbs, things like run, kick, jump, throw, whatever it might be, the same parts of my brain that are being used to say those words are the same parts of my brain that are activated when I actually do those actions. So yes, you could be, and I would do this as well, say that, oh, that's just like the words you choose. But storytelling is a big part of storytelling is about the words you choose. And so the language we use, the way in which we use that language, the way in which we try to connect with folks, that really matters, not just from like, this is a good thing, we should all like care about one another, we should all just listen to one another and empathize, but also there is a biological component to it, and that means a lot to me, especially as a scientist. And storytelling, in part, can shift the ways we think about one another and the ways in which folks perceive us. There's some really interesting work out there asking folks about how they perceive certain character traits and certain professions and kind of how they rate them on a scale. And what we're learning is that sometimes there can be a disconnect between how competent one is seen, maybe not just sometimes, how competent one is seen and how warm they are. And maybe y'all are thinking, and I know I've definitely thought this, that like, do I want to be seen? Do I need to be seen as warm? Do we need kind of like feelings in all of this? We're professionals. There's no room for any of this. And I'm not advocating for any sort of replacement of our professional rigor, anything like that. But we're learning that when we try to relate to folks, they are more willing to receive our messages than not. And so some of the science is backing this up. There was a study done, a handful now of studies done by Fisk and Dupree, where, like I said, they went out and they asked folks, just kind of random folks on the street. It was more rigorous than that, but not necessarily scientists, let's put it that way. How they perceived certain careers, certain professions, individuals in certain professions. And what they found, so they basically rated them on a scale of competent to incompetent, warm to cold, and asked them how they perceived certain professions. And there were so many different ones. But as you can see in the upper left, scientists and engineers, and there could be an argument made that folks like teachers and doctors and nurses are also scientists, but the way they did it for this study, scientists, engineers are seen as incredibly competent, but not very warm. Whereas individuals like teachers and doctors, and granted, this was a 2014 study, like COVID did a lot of things, but these feelings, I just have to acknowledge that, but these feelings generally persist. But folks like teachers and doctors are seen as very competent, but also warm. There's a reason why the phrase bedside manner exists. There's a reason why folks, I have a very good friend who's a teacher who is also a PhD scientist, and what she does is, I cannot admire her enough because of how she is able to relate to people and emote and empathize with her fifth graders. It is a sight to behold. But what we're learning is that even within this scale, within this spectrum, for whatever reason, folks like scientists and engineers are seen with envy, like, oh, you're really competent, but you're not quite relating to me on this personal level. Well, I don't quite respond to that as an audience, and maybe I'm even a little bit envious of that, whereas folks like doctors and teachers are seen with admiration. Now, this is an example from, I looked, the word publisher was not in this study, so I will just say that. And many of the examples I have are from scientists, kind of from the research world, but a lot of these components can be applied to, frankly, any field. My partner is a government consultant, which means nothing to many, many people. And she's a fantastic communicator, and we talk about this stuff a lot. I bounce ideas off of her all the time. And her world is somewhere, honestly, it's probably on the lower part of the spectrum. Folks just like ask her what she does and doesn't really get a chance to get into it. But we can apply a lot of these principles to any single profession. So the examples I have are from scientists, and y'all are part of a world that works very closely with scientists, but storytelling in general can help push some of these maybe envious, or in the case of she's not going to love that I use her as an example, but that's okay. My partner, like some of these lower qualities, maybe into the admiration. I'm not saying it's going to be the solve. I'm not going to be saying it's the thing, but it can help, and it's a tool we already have. It's a thing we already do, even if we might not realize that we do it. And we know, again, from kind of the social science, that stories are interesting, they're understandable, believable, persuasive. It's a way of communicating and talking about anything, but in this case, like what we do, why we matter, why what we do matters, in a way that's not just, hey, here's the facts, like you need me type of deal. And again, I can speak for myself as a person who teaches fellow scientists how to communicate more effectively. If I say to them like, y'all really need me, that's true, but also they're not going to respond to that. Rather, who's an audience you want to reach? What's the message you're trying to convey? What's the point you're trying to get across? I can help you with that, and I can work with you to help you with that. It's not just me plopping in and saying, I know better than all of you, like, here's what you should do, even if that might be the case. It's how do we work together? How can I listen to you to figure out what you want, what you need, what your message can be? And story is maybe not the tool, but it is definitely a tool to do this. And if we talk through story, if we kind of relate to folks, we can change perspectives of how we are perceived. So again, science examples here, but really interesting study with Story Collider, actually, a professor at a community college teaching a science course for non-majors did this study where he presented his students with, he asked his students what they thought about certain scientific qualities. Like, what does it take to be a scientist? Who are scientists? Who is science, essentially? And then throughout the course of this course, exposed them to personal stories of scientists, whether that was through Story Collider stories, whether that was through written profiles, whatever it might be. And then at the end of the course, asked them again what their perceptions of science and scientists were, and then followed up 6 months later, which is really important, kind of that longevity study. And asked the students kind of what some of their stereotypical responses were. And I remember pulling from this were, what are scientists? It's folks who wear lab coats, white men who work in labs. Albert Einstein literally came up as a stereotype. So some of these like preconceived notions of what people think, and again, of scientists in this case, but you could apply this to frankly any profession. Expose them to story throughout the course of this course, and at the end of the course, many of these stereotypes, many of these perceptions went away. Some of the pool quotes were, scientists can be any type of person. It's all type of people. Doesn't just have to be men. There were more, but those were some of the big ones. And then followed up 6 months later, and actually have been doing more and more of this like over the years. Story Collider, my colleagues at Story Collider have been working with this specific professor for a while now. These opinions are holding. These stereotypes are being continued to break down. And again, story was a tool used in this. Maybe it's not the end-all be-all tool, but it has helped with those kind of perceptions and stereotypes. And another one is just maybe in addition to storytelling, it's just kind of this human experience, this idea of relating to people to show them that we are just people too who happen to do a job that they might rely on. So there was a group of school kids, 7th graders, who went to Fermilab, one of the national labs, and beforehand they were asked to draw what they thought a scientist looks like. These are some representative examples. I do not know. I have worn a lab coat in my day, and I don't think I've ever worn a lab coat with that many buttons on it. But this is almost across the board what every single one of them drew, no matter who the kid was, no matter what their gender or race or their demographic background or whatever it was, where they come from, almost every single one of them drew this. And then they went to Fermilab. They met the scientists. They talked to them. Again, it's scientists in this case, but it could literally be anyone. Like, take your kid to work day. These same kids drew these exact pictures. I love that. And again, I'm showing you spotlight studies. I am showing you a handful of things. So you can take that with a grain of salt, but we're seeing replication in a lot of these. We know the value of replication in studies, especially folks in this room. And so they had, of course, I'm sure the scientists told them stories about what they do and how they got there and their career options and all of that. But also, they just related to them. They showed that they were just human beings, that they're not this big, scary, in this case, scientists, maybe in some of your case, like the publisher. But they showed that there were ways to work with folks and to think about folks in a different way and actually show, in this case, the true them, the true scientists. And authors are out there trying to tell their stories. Like I mentioned before, I was trying to tell my story, not just of my research, but why this research meant so much to me and where I was in my career. And then these days, I'm just telling all sorts of stories about science, even if it might not be specifically research. And there, of course, are a number of ways that authors tell stories. They tell them through research manuscripts. That's the big thing. And again, I must say, many of the examples I used are based on my own personal experience. So if your organization is not listed here, please don't take it personally. Again, it's what I know, and it's what I've had experience with. I am out of the kind of research journal game these days, more in this kind of pop sci story type of journals, but even just in this slide and a little bit of research that I was doing, I was like, okay, I know scientific manuscripts. Like, this is a world in which I was deeply ingrained in for many years. And now I'm on this kind of secondary, maybe pop sci is not even the right word for it, but telling stories about science and scientists in a way that is still for the same audience, still for scientists and maybe their peers, but also for other audiences, for other folks, to help them get the word out about not just what they're doing, but who they are and what they care about and what their values are, and to break down these kind of barriers to science and instill trust in science. We know that stories and different ways of communicating can help instill trust in science and scientists. And I try not to use the like now more than ever thing a lot, but it's really valuable right this very second, considering the state of our world and what we've come out of in the past few years. And then beyond that, there are ways that folks are telling their stories and getting the word out, not just from a kind of self-promotion and a marketing side of things, which I think is really important. I tell everyone to like talk about all the good work they do. Something scientists are very uncomfortable with is talking about themselves. If they don't, no one will. But also getting the word out about what they're doing through things like social media. And we're finding more and more from a communication perspective that if folks are tweeting about, or Instagram, or even like TikTok these days, if they are promoting their work, they are more likely to get eyes on their research. They're more likely to have people cite them, actually, when they get to when they're writing their scientific journals or when they're writing their manuscripts, because we know the people in our fields who are the experts, we know the research, but also many folks are online these days. And so when, say, I'm writing my manuscript, I know the big players, but also I'm on Twitter, for better or for worse, and I see people in my field who I didn't realize were doing thing X, Y, or Z. And so I see that and go, oh, okay, maybe I'll cite them as well. And this is on the part of, on the individual, this is on the part of the manuscript, the journal that's publishing their actual study. I know, again, examples I know about, but we at AGU, we promote manuscripts all the time. I don't know the metrics on those, that's about as far as I can get, but I do know that this is a thing that's happening, and it's helping the authors tell their story, and also coming back so that if folks are reading that person's manuscript, then they're going to that journal and potentially reading other things, and so it's kind of this down-the-line process. And one thing I had this kind of in some of the initial conversations I was having leading up to this, and something I work with and hear from my colleagues all the time, is that, so again, it was actually kind of really fun because I got to dig into like what we actually have at AGU, because again, I am adjacent to this work, or adjacent to this group, but not in them. But there's, like, and again, not just AGU, but entire guides of publishing and that type of thing. But something that really stood out, and the way this rendered, like this was supposed to go, ta-da, and it didn't. But that's okay. But this part here, it's a 6-part process, and this part is, this last part here is essentially like promoting your paper. And it's in the official guide that we have to, as part of the scientific process, a part of the publication process. It's not just like going through all the things to actually get the paper out. It's, okay, now what? And now what do we do? How do we get people to read it? How do we get eyes on it? Like I said, good from a scientist perspective, but good from a journal perspective, from an organizational perspective, from a publisher perspective. So this is something that I know in my work. This is literally most of what I do, is helping folks tell the stories kind of beyond publication. But also, it's encouraging to see, and again, I know it's not just AGU, that folks are recognizing that it doesn't just stop at publication, that there are steps beyond that, because in addition to things like alt metrics or whatever it might be, getting more eyes, getting more ears listening to a podcast, more views on a video, whatever it might be, that's just good for everyone, not just the author. And this might seem like a, well, duh, Shane, this is why you're here. But I had to explicitly put this up there because before kind of like coming here and doing this and thinking about this in a really critical way, for me, I was just like, oh, of course. Like, this is without kind of like the publishing industry, I wouldn't probably be here because I wouldn't have been able to get my science out there. I wouldn't have been able to get eyes on it, to be able to do the work that I was doing, to have the experiences that I had. And I started this whole thing off by saying we all are storytellers. And I don't just mean that from a like hokey, I have to say that. I truly believe that. Scientists are really great storytellers, even if they don't realize it, because they do really cool stuff. But publishers, y'all, no matter what, and I'm using the word like publishers as a whole maybe don't quite understand it, all the nuance and everything, but we all, no matter what you're doing, no matter how you're involved in this industry, no matter how you're involved, you're helping folks get the word out about what they do. You're helping folks communicate about what they do. And you're telling stories in one way, shape, or form, even if it's not like the mechanics of storytelling. So I literally put this up there to like not just remind myself, but maybe remind some of you. And so when I talk about stories, I've been moving around this a little bit, but just some brief specifics of like what actually makes a story. Stories are beginnings and ends. There's always like the thing that happens up front, and there's a thing that happens in the middle or at the end, but then something changes. And science lends itself to storytelling incredibly well because the whole idea of science is discovery. Something is discovered, something is determined, something is changed. All good stories have change to them. A story without change is an anecdote. Anecdotes are fine. We probably tell each other anecdotes every single day. But all good stories have an element of change to them. And there's always this idea of a story arc. An arc can take many different forms, but basically there's this intro, there's this inciting incident, something happens, rising action, think about like any sort of a journey, any sort of a movie you've watched or book you've read. The big like aha moment in science, that is the discovery, or maybe the lack of discovery, like, oh, this didn't work. That's still a story to tell. That's still, we tried this, it didn't work, let's try it again. And then there's falling action and resolution. Stories don't end at the climax. Movies are really bad about that. You'll have 2.5 hours of like a Marvel movie and then 5 minutes of the drop off, and that is still a story arc, but it's not quite even. And people think that stories are really straightforward. They think that like there is this beginning, middle, end, and oftentimes it's like this. It's much more convoluted. It's much less straightforward. And there are also kind of ways people respond to story, kind of these emotional arcs to storytelling. There's an interesting study where they surveyed 40,000 different works of fiction and came out with these kind of main story arcs as to what we feel as an audience, what these emotional arcs are. And we can relate to some of these. It's rags to riches, tragedy, Cinderella with the up and down. So there's many different ways to think about story. And these emotional arcs oftentimes happen in the journey and like the main bulk of what a story is. So maybe when with a scientific manuscript or something, the main part of the story is like the methods, which is funny because like, we don't really know if we think about that way, but that's where probably a lot of the interesting stuff happens from a personal perspective. And stories contain characters, they contain events, some sort of consequence. These are kind of the basic components of what I think about when I think of story, whether it's for Storyclad or for AGU, just my own personal conversations with all of you in this room. And so I just wanted to really kind of at the end here, kind of pull all these things together, because I've been talking to y'all for better part of 40 minutes now. I've touched on a bunch of different things, and just really kind of pulling these things back together. I can't stress this enough. I mean, this is obviously why I'm here, but I want to instill in all of you that in your day jobs, in your profession, in your personal life, come tell a story with Storycladder, that'd be great. Everyone in this room is a storyteller, whether that's personally, professionally. So just really kind of keep that in mind. If there's one thing you take away, take that away. Authors are storytellers, and they're not necessarily just telling the story of what their science results are, but how they got there, who they are, what their methods were, the trials, the tribulations, the things they've had to overcome. There's a broader picture to just, this is the thing I did, these are the results, let's move on to the next thing. There's so much more than that. And I think that sometimes, coming from the sciences, I thought many times like I was in a tragedy. When I was going through my scientific process. I want it to be in kind of the rags to riches, like, yeah, everything's great, but frankly, things are probably more like the Cinderella story, but we can still kind of end on a high note, end on a positive note, and use story to communicate effectively. It might not always be easy. We might not win them all. I'm here, I'm telling you a thing for 40 minutes. You all actually have to go back and work in the systems you're in, the organizations, with the people you have to work with. So again, story can be a tool that hopefully help with this, but it might not necessarily be easy, and just want to recognize that. But we are all in this kind of scientific endeavor together, even if we're not researchers, even if we like never thought we would be in the sciences, even if we don't day to day think about what we do being in the sciences. Like, we're all in it. It is all part of us, kind of regardless of our background, of who we are, or frankly, even how much we care about science. And I just want to end this quote from one of our storytellers, that we must show people how they belong in science and how science belongs to them. And I think that storytelling is one way to do that, regardless of whether you're a publisher, whether you're a scientist, whether you are civilian off the street that has nothing to, like the people outside of it, has nothing to do with what we're talking about today. And so with that, I want to thank you all for listening. I want to thank you all for having me. I got married last year, and like we had these cardboard cutouts of my dog, and so this is my profile picture for everything. Yeah, and happy to take questions in the handful of minutes that I have left.